Cartesian, perhaps best Euclidean geometry across European rural spaces in the same time. In the very years that those villas that I was, an example of which I've just shown, were being constructed, the lowlands of the Venetian Republic were being transformed by a geometry of drainage and water regulation that you can still see today. This dates precisely from the 1550s, 1560s. This is, of course, a mode of colonization through survey, through mapping, a colonization which was later carried into Europe's overseas imperial landscapes, a point I'll come back to. Time and again, historically, we find that the surveyors and map makers are also the landscape painters. Take, for example, to stay for a moment in this period, the Venetian, or better, actually Veronese, Cristoforo Sorte, born in 1509, died in the 1590s, as a surveyor on the one hand, one of the key Venetian surveyors who is concerned with producing the maps that and leveling that could create this landscape, but at the same time the writer of what the art historian E.H. Gombrich once claimed was the very first treatise on landscape painting, his Osservazioni nella pittura. Here we see Cristoforo Sorte surveying the boundaries of the Venetian territories between Venice and the Habsburg Empire. Here we see him upside down, sorry about that, with essentially a map which bears relations, could we see it the right way up at least, to the perspective that Bruegel himself was producing about the same period. Here, though, a coloured map for the drainage of the Treviso region of Venice. It's a relationship between mapping and landscape that is not in any way confined to the 16th century. We can find it all the way through the surveyors and landscape makers of 18th century England, indeed right up to the Ellis Martin's illustrations here for the Ordnance Survey map, the first popular edition. In other words, when the map moves from being primarily a military device to being something whereby a way that people can see England, as Ellis Martin's framed landscape precisely shows, using the map to see the landscape and to understand it, and of course colouring, that's upside down again, colouring the map with a whole new set of tones in order to make it popular. And this, I think, articulates the continued interconnection of mapping, painting, and landscape. So the space of survey and mapping. The space, too, of painting and perspective. Here, the tools of the surveyor are, of course, or could similarly be the tools of the landscape painting, the pencil, the frame, the brush, and so on. New modes of representing the world and experiencing the world in the urbanized regions of 15th century Europe. Landscape appears in very specific parts of Europe as a mode of a form of art, a form of painting. In Upper Italy, in Flanders, in southern Germany, the most urbanized and commercialized parts of the continent, just as we've seen in the Lorenzetti. So precisely from the city into a country that lies beyond. Around Siena, in this case, Bel Paesaggio landscape lies immediately beyond the city. But it lies beyond not simply in the sense of being seen, but of course being owned and purchased and sold. It's perhaps, of course, worth remembering that it's precisely in this urban context that perspective is first demonstrated in the in the famous experiment by Brunelleschi, where the baptistry at Florence is projected onto a frame and screen, and three-dimensional space is accurately represented in the portals of Florence Cathedral. Religious and secular art increasingly incorporate, from the 15th century, in both Flanders and in Italy, an aestheticized natural world into a rigorously controlled perspectival space. Landscape, of course, shares this painterly spatiality with other artistic representations. The landscape is a natural world framed, composed, selected. It bears close relations with the space of theatre, and the fact that many of the most familiar landscape painters have also been designers of theatre sets, I think indicates this. Canaletto, de Luterbourg, Repton, the landscape gardener, and of course even the inventor, one of the inventors of photography, Daguerre, himself a painter of dioramas, which emphasized landscape. So landscape is first a painting, and only historically later a painterly way of seeing actual land and constructing it according to certain notions of space. For example, as here in a painting from Richard Wilson of North Wales, we see somebody using a clawed glass, a glass that will allow you to look through and see the actual land as if it were painted in the mode of Claude Lorraine, as of course Kader Idris itself is presented here. The space too of identity. Landscape relates to a new interest in boundaries and bounding space in terms of self and other in the creation of a social world. Landscape, after all, was the representational mode by which Europeans imagined and represented new lands and peoples beyond Europe in precisely the period that I've been emphasizing, in the moment of discovery and conquest. Spaces through which difference and identity were forged. The critic W.J.T. Mitchell has recently called landscape, I'm quoting him, the dream work of empire. And I think there's much to support this. From the geographically distantiated world, landscape that I've referred to, and which we see here in Altdorfer's wonderful painting of the battle with against the Persian army, Darius, where we actually see Cyprus in the middle distance. We can see a representation of the Nile Delta and the Gulf of Sinai, and here we are, in a sense, in Macedonia, looking literally over globally across the junction point of Europe, Asia, and Africa. From that landscape to, and Bruegel, of course, to the idealized utopias and tropical Edens by which Europeans appropriated visually the New World. Here, an English engraver represents, actually it's Debris, so it's not, no, it's a German engraver, but representing an English narrative of the landscapes of Virginia, seen in the mode of an English hunting park. From this appropriation of other spaces right through to those tropical Edens which still illustrate our holiday brochures and candy wrappers, and finally to the sublime spaces of fear and wonder, whereby untamed nature escapes the limits that landscape imposes. Here in one of Martin's paintings of the vastnesses of the Alps, and I will have more to say later on in this series about these landscapes of the European sublime imagination, of poles, deserts, and jungles, as they used to be called before they came rainforests. The military link to this bounding and controlling of space in landscape is, of course, very close indeed. And it's something I will be discussing under the notion of the landscape as power. Gaining a perspective, commanding a vista, controlling a vantage point. J. Appleton, some years ago, developed an entire thesis of what he called habitat theory out of this recognition, by trying to relate the aesthetic pleasures of landscape to a primal animal need for security, for seeing without being seen. And here, in a late German landscape, we can see that notion almost of camouflage in the trench, whereby one enters into the landscape in a relationship of seeing, but of course one that becomes itself visceral. The distanciation of military technology since the 14th century from architecture that produces this new form of spatial organization of the city, through to laser-guided missiles that, of course, we can watch on the screen, following the topography, following the landscapes, has reinforced the relationship between the military and landscape, one that was worked out famously in Lancelot Brown's landscape design at Blenheim, where the clumps of trees are claimed to articulate the squares at the eponymous battle. Landscape, therefore, shares a spatiality of power with other technologies of surveillance. Let me turn to that corporeal space that I've just indicated. The aesthetics and distanciation involved in seeing without being seen have, I think, more recently been related to gendered forms of control over a different other space, the space of the body itself, and specifically the feminized body. Among my geographical colleagues, Gillian Rose and Catherine Nash, have indicated the insistence of the male voice in the aesthetic and sexual language used to describe both landscape and female bodies, from John Donne and Andrew Marvell in the 17th century to the tradition of the fête champêtre, the notions of exploration, mystery, desire, penetration that relate to landscape, they've pointed out, connect deeply to the language, to a gendered language in relation to bodies. Certainly, of course, placing a female in a verdant landscape plays on ideas of fertility and fecundity. This may not always imply male heterosexual predation, of course, and the links between space and flesh are historically complex, as Richard Sennett's recent work shows in the case of the city. And I'm sure there is a text to be written on flesh and landscape as much as flesh and stone. Among the earliest landscape depictions in European art are those, of course, of the enclosed garden, within which the Virgin suckles the Christ child. In Bruegel's Icarus II, if you recall, the ploughman's attachment to the land is corporeal, and the theme of the husbandman married to the land is a recurrent one in European landscape, as here in Constable's painting. It exemplifies the duality of meaning in landscape that I referred to earlier, of distanciation and attachment. Landscape as a socio-spatial concept and an environmental experience. That same duality is, of course, inherent in the psychological spaces of landscape. Landscape's capacity to express and evoke feeling, sentiment, awe, and wonder was central to much of the discourse surrounding landscape gardening and painting in Georgian England, where ideas of the beautiful, sublime, and picturesque in Edmund Burke, Gilpin, Richard Payne Knight, and others became central to one of the most intense debates about the meaning of landscape that we have. Psychological space in landscape is produced primarily through the manipulation of light and topographic form. The crepuscular landscape is elegiac. The auroral landscape, fresh and optimistic. The abyss is awful, the curving carriageway over shaven lawn reassuring. These characteristic forms, colours, skies of the seasons and the latitudes govern the spaces of memory and anticipation, as I will discuss later. In all these spaces, then, it's the eye which mediates internal and external space, the spaces of nature and those of the body, the heart, and the mind. The corporeal eye itself is the measure of space in landscape: personal space, social space, virtual space. The eye seizes the natural world and expresses authority over extended nature through the vocabulary of landscape. Let me finish by just making a few comments about how these theoretical spatialities connect to the techniques of spatial manipulation, the vocabulary of space in landscape, if you like. This is, of course, immediately apparent in the pictorial space of landscape, which I have been arguing as primary, determining the characteristic way that we relate to the natural world itself when we treat it as landscape. The point of the eye, of course, the height of the eye in relation to external space creates different relations of self and landscape, from the vertical to the oblique, from the silhouetted skyline, as here in a mapping of the city view, through the oblique landscape view, as we actually call it, where in a sense we stand as Ortelius and his friend Hufnagel do in this representation of the coast of Calabria, through to the high-angled world landscape, and ultimately, of course, the map view itself, the vertical global image. And a discourse of knowledge, authority, and sacredness is able to be articulated through these various positions of the eye in relation to space. Framing, of course, provides the primary boundary of landscape space. It is the spatial basis for selection, for exclusion and incorporation, for composition. It's framing that authors form. Landscape's profound connections with theatre that I've already mentioned are, I think, apparent here. The landscape coulisse is the wings behind the proscenium arch, classically articulated, of course, in the Claudian template here, which became the basis for the English landscape garden from William Kent onwards, here seen at Rousham. Light, of course, is the principal means of providing depth, physically and emotionally, in landscape. Aerial perspective, as Leonardo da Vinci explicitly theorized in his notebooks, determines distance, color, illumination within the frame, the sources and intensity of light controlling mood and meaning, as in this rather nice image from the Courtauld collection of a sublime landscape. If we turn from painted landscape to the mapped spaces of designed landscape, I just draw attention to three geometries, recalling that geometry, and particularly applied geometry, is the spatial expression always precisely of human consciousness within nature and human presence. This is taken from a edition of Euclid's opera. Euclid, of course, the principal Greek writer on geometry, but relating illustrating rather a narrative about the shipwreck of Aristippus that comes from Vitruvius, where Aristippus is supposed to have been shipwrecked on the shore of Rhodes, and as he comes ashore with his companions, he says, "Let us fear not on this alien shore, because here I see the marks of man." In other words, geometry implies precisely a human intervention in nature, the beginnings of a cultural transformation, the beginnings, if you like, of landscape to some extent. Of those spatial orders that become imposed upon the natural world, the grid, of course, is the one that depends upon the vocabulary of orthogonal lines and right angles. Socially, it generates a democratic form of landscape order. After all, there's no center to the grid. In theory, as Jefferson's Land Ordinance Act in dividing the spaces of the United States intended to demonstrate, it is the spatial order of a democratic and egalitarian system. We might also point out it's a colonizing, infinitely extendable and boundless form of shaping natural space and turning it into landscape on the grand scale. The radial, on the other hand, of course, deploys the vocabulary of the orthogonal line and the point. Socially, it traditionally has expressed a centralizing and authoritarian form of landscape order, as in Versailles or in the great gardens, the other great gardens of Le Nôtre. It's recurrently linked with the landscapes of power. On the other hand, the curving or serpentine line, Hogarth's so-called line of beauty, here expressed in the concrete culvert that runs through Kent's Garden at Rousham, is in more contemporary terms the ecological line, the corporeal line of the human body and the tamed natural world, one that, for example, was used in the celebration of the Autobahnen as in the 1930s in Germany as not only an expression of modernism, but equally an expression of the ecological naturalness of the link between human beings and the natural world that the Autobahnen themselves were intended to express, and indeed to promote, because after all, one of the reasons for the route selected for the Autobahns was precisely so that they would reveal views of landscape and thereby generate or reinforce the sense of national identity and attachment to the German landscape through which they were constructed. Socially, the curving line, of course, has often been taken to harmonize the body politic, the softened line of landscape implying unity and integration, as in this painting by Richard Wilson of Lakeside Cottage, where the curving serpentine line that leads the eye through the painting moves from the peasant family in the shade in the front of the painting through the proprietor with his group of guests and the plein air viewing of the landscape, the humble cottage, through the great house, and finally, of course, the harmony of society and land blessed by the Anglican church that lies at the top of the hill. Landscape spatialities, then, are complex. They underlie and weave through all that I want to say as I try to think through landscape with you in these lectures. These spatialities author nature's inscriptions by humans as landscape. They signify culture, they express power, they manifest the sacred, and they communicate memory. Thank you.
Denis Cosgrove could take some questions, if there are any, at this point. Or maybe they'll come as the lectures unfold. Does anyone have a question? A question from Irene. Back.
There is no doubt that the notion of landscape, and perhaps in particular in the last 10 years, has been a major contribution in architecture circles in the way we understand the environment. And I guess your erudite lecture is a case in
advantage on me in the sense that you're probably much more conscious, aware and knowledgeable about the practice of landscape than I. And primarily my concern is and has been, as far as my interest in landscape is concerned, to try and historicize it, to try and understand where it comes from, how relations that on the one hand are deeply felt and deeply personal, and on the other hand inevitably social, have been structured and mediated historically. Clearly there has been practice throughout, and I've tried to indicate tonight about the strong relationships between, if you like, an aesthetic on the one hand and the practice of shaping, transforming, ordering land, for example, through surveying on the other. I'm not sure that I can say, I mean, I'm sure I can say, but I'm not sure I can say anything of any depth or meaning on practice. I'm not myself sort of sufficiently detailed. I would be sufficiently experienced to do that. What I would be interested in doing, perhaps at some point during these or at the end of this series of lectures, will be to sit down with those of you who do actually practice and work this thing through with you. I think at this point, for me, if you like to come ex cathedra with some notion of how you can put this into practice, would be arrogant at best and almost certainly stupid. But forgive me, I'm not evading the question. I prefer to work it through by listening to, if you like, what those who actually do practice can make of this.
Maybe I should ask the same question
In
in a
another way.
different way that,
You want an
that
answer?
relates to the work that you're doing. Because I think one of the things that's very interesting is precisely this idea of the relationship between landscape and city, and the way in which you construct this notion that the landscape is not this innocent thing that's somehow out there, but in fact it's constructed in a very particular way, and then it has a very particular relationship to urbanity, in a sense. And I think we are now at a point where we've discovered that, in fact, many of the experiences of urbanity, in a sense, for example, the role, the work of urban planners and so on, have also got a very particular kind of historical condition. They result in certain constructions. What might be interesting, again, this is something that maybe could be answered in terms of working through, but what would be interesting is to find or to discuss situations where landscape as a situation, as a construct, can also deal with its distanciation in a way from urbanity, from the city, because now it revisits the city, etc. So what are some of the polemics, what are some of the theories that are being developed in landscape theory, in cultural geography, for example, in relation to questions of landscape, which might now be seen not as something which comes from the city, but now revisits, in a sense, urbanity, revisits the city. I think that's less instrumental than the way that Irene is asking the question in terms of a kind of answer, but I think probably related to this topic in terms of the way in which landscape could be viewed as a way of constructing certain urban polemics rather than the city being the position from which one sees the landscape.
Clearly, and it was obvious in the slide that I showed, for example, of Siena. You begin with a very sharp divide where you literally can, in a sense, stand on the wall or stand in the tower, look out and see landscape and see bel paesaggio, if you like. The one thing, of course, that we know is that the collapse of that boundary is now complete, and so much of the discourse about landscape and its conservation in England is generated by what is effectively a suburban landscape. After all, villages in England are simply spatially disaggregated suburbs. And they don't really, except in very few places, have a life or an authenticity beyond that. And yet, at the same time, the notion of trying to fix representations or images of landscape within those and for those through the instruments of planning and conservation becomes yet more and more intense. And of course, much of what has been done, particularly in this country in cultural geography, has focused precisely upon the way in which identities, national and local, are worked and reworked, regionally, locally, nationally, through images of landscape that, as you say, are in no sense innocent, but have been but are layered with meanings. I think to some extent we may have overstressed the social and ideological content of this, and rather we may be beginning finally to come back and think about the more corporeal dimensions of it. And I think that's one thing that cultural geographers have had much more difficulty in handling. And there's a debate, for example, that's going on now about between, more in the United States than here, between the cultural geographers with their insistence upon metaphors of text and theatre and so on for landscape that I've been talking about, and the environmental historians who have been insisting on, if you like, recovering the notion of nature as having agency. And that's something that I think has yet to be worked through. That, in my opinion, will have very considerable implications because, of course, it pulls in the ecological, I suppose the ecological green dimension of this. I mean, the conservation debate is no longer the innocent one either that we once thought it was. It's profoundly compromised in all sorts of ways. I want to talk about this a little more next week.
I'm a little bothered by your seeming, even though it's really intended, your seeming to identify the rise of correlate with the rise of landscape, the rise of surveying. Because it seems to me that whatever landscape is, and whatever surveying is, they're at odds with each other. And that if I was asked to define what a landscape is, it is that which lies at the edge of surveying. It's always slightly beyond the scope of surveying. And
Sorry, can I interrupt you? In what sense beyond the scope? Do you mean beyond?
It's that which you're not able to grasp in the act of survey. For instance, if you go to Scotland with a map, the delight in being in Scotland, as far as it becomes a landscape, is precisely the point at which you actually can't quite use the map anymore. And that you're slightly out of control, in fact, or that the landscape is slightly out of control. And it seems to me that in historiographical documentary terms, there's a sort of strand of evidence that you're overlooking, which perhaps might be more literary, more narrative, and it's precisely to do with testifying and witnessing to the fact of getting lost. And I'm thinking of certain kinds of, as I say, a poem like Sir Gawain, The Green Knight, which constantly plays with the business of being identified the inner particular landscape, namely Cheshire and Lancashire and the Lake District and Staffordshire. But at the same time, it's constantly going vague about just exactly where you are. And the most powerful sentiments of early landscape painting to me are those by Alsdorfer, in which he seems to be precisely at the point of losing your way. And to that extent, landscape cannot be identified with surveying.
It's an interesting point, and I wouldn't want to suggest there's a closure around it, but I think you're taking one strand, and which is important, and which you're absolutely right, I haven't covered here. I want to deal with that. This is becoming a kind of an echo. I want to deal with that next week. I simply wanted to talk precisely about spatiality this week. Now, it seems to me that the kind of loss you're talking about and the references you draw upon are, to some extent, you say it's the point where the map, if you like, fades out, the point where, if you like, culture becomes nature almost, where the control is lost and the map implies control. I mean, I think there are various ways. There's no doubt a tradition of landscape that draws upon that, but I'm not sure that it's the only one. I'm not even sure it's the dominant one. The one that I've been trying to establish is one that is precisely very closely related, certainly in terms of representation and the tradition of representation, and what has been called landscape and defined, has used the term and used it in as a mode of, certainly of art, and also in the literary tradition, prospect poetry, for example, plays upon notions of survey. I mean, if you think about Denham and others in the 17th century, use precisely in the literary sense the notion of survey and surveying, and indeed to some extent surveillance. But I mean, for me, a landscape comes alive through, for example, the topographic map. I mean, I clearly don't see it or associate it with it in the same way as you. That's not to privilege my way of seeing it any more than yours. What I'm saying is, I think there is very considerable documentary and historical evidence for the position I've been taking. But there is also a countervailing thrust in landscape, which I think, for example, in the American usage of the term, where landscape almost becomes non-humanized nature, touches upon a tradition much closer to the one that I think possibly you're talking about, and which I do intend to deal with when I talk about the relationship between landscape and nature.
Okay, I think we should end there. There'll be a lot of opportunity to question the further lectures, which we look forward to very much indeed, and thank you for listening.